In case you're wondering if the pastor of Epic Church is a football fan, the answer is yes. So just everyone with ease know that you're part of we didn't know if we would have 11 o'clock service today, so you guys are certainly the more spiritual ones. And on a serious note, though, I will have you out by noon, okay? All right, that's the only time I'm going to promise that. But today, you're going to get it. And some of you are like, wow, there's a football game straight up 12 o'clock, all right? So pastor's a football fan. No, seriously, we made a promise in our church-wide email this week that we would have you out by noon. So we're going to do that. It means I have to cut out all my funny jokes. But nonetheless, we're going to make sure we keep the important stuff in there. A lot of things going on. In fact, before you leave today, we're going to give you an opportunity to sign up for quite a few Super Bowl parties that are epic. Super Bowl party is going to be hosted at different homes in Soma, and so it'll be worth you staying around for the teaching just for that purpose. Don't worry about getting out too late. We're not going to get out too late, but let's focus in on, for the next 25 minutes or so, what it is that we have some assumptions about. And we're in part 3 of our Reset series, and what we've been saying for those of you who are new maybe here, we've been saying that in this Reset series, what we want to be able to do is just hit the reset button in our lives and kind of examine what do we really value? Are we doing the right kinds of things with our time? Are we doing the right kind of things with our relationships, our money, on and on and on? And this morning, one of the great reasons I'm going to tell you that you and I should hit the reset button in some ways daily and other times weekly, monthly, seasonally, or even annually, one of the great reasons to hit the reset button is that it gives us an opportunity to challenge and question some of the assumptions you and I have about life. There may have been a great reason that we had those assumptions, but sometimes we get an assumption in life and we just go on with the rest of our lives. And do you ever find yourself going, wait, I just need to step back and make sure that what I assume about this area of my life is in fact what is real about my life? Does that make sense? And I want to throw out a huge assumption today that many of us have. In fact, even Jesus' disciples had this assumption, and here's the assumption, their theme at least, that they had great assumptions about what they were to do with power and authority and leadership and position. And so what I am hoping and praying that God will do in my heart this morning and in our heart as a church, that he will challenge some of the assumptions we have about power and authority and rule and reign and those kinds of things. And so that's what I want to do. Now, if you're not a follower of Jesus, what I want you to do is just listen in this morning. I think you'll be amazed at the kind of Messiah and the kind of Savior that Jesus is. I think you'll just be, especially along the lines of things like power and leadership and authority and position. And if you are a follower of Jesus and you're part of the crew in our church, want to say, hey, you know what? I want to see what it looks like to follow Jesus with my entire life. I want you to be astounded as well. And then I want you to allow yourself to challenge what you assume about power, prestige, position, authority. And so that's what I want to do today. Now, I want to give us a couple of verses so that when we get into the teaching time, I think how often you and I will be astounded as we read the story later on. I want to set up a couple of verses that will increase the chance of you and I being astounded. So Matthew chapter 28, verse 18 through 20 is where Jesus gives what's known as the Great Commission. And what he does in that text is he says, here's the strategy for the movement of Christianity for the rest of time. Basically, he tells the disciples, go and make other disciples in really this multiplicative effort, make other disciples of all nations. And so that's the strategy. But before Jesus gives the strategy, he says this. And again, we're thinking in terms of assumptions about power and position and prestige that you and I have and the disciples had. Jesus said this in this part. All authority, he said this to the disciples, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. All authority in heaven and on the earth has been given to me. Now, just think about that. Even if you're the CEO of an incredible company, you probably don't have all authority in that company, right? You report to a board of directors. You have a lot of authority, but you don't have all of it. Some of us know we don't even have all authority in our home, do we? If you have roommates or if you have a wife, guys, we know that we don't have all authority when it comes even to our homes at times. But Jesus says, not just in a company and not just over the entire earth, but he has all authority in heaven and on earth. That's quite a bit of authority, isn't it? And the question is, what does he do with all of that authority? What would you do with all of that authority? I would make certain teams not catch the ball today, right? I would cause there's all kind of things I would do, I think, if I had all authority in heaven and on earth, and you could just change anything you wanted to, and you could make your kids do certain things. It would be awesome. What does he do with all authority? How does he wield this sort of power? And I think you're going to be astounded when we get there in a second. Now I want to give you the verse that precedes our passage, and then in a moment we'll get into the Bible. Mark chapter 10, verse 34, Jesus and his disciples are headed to Jerusalem, and they're not headed to Jerusalem for a field trip. They're headed there because Jesus has set his face towards Jerusalem, meaning he's headed there to accomplish the full weight of his mission, which is to die a really horrific death upon a cross. So that's where he's headed. And if you need to understand this context. So when you see his disciples talk to him about their assumptions regarding power, you need to know that Jesus has just said this to them. Here's what he said. He finishes this part of the conversation. They're headed to Jerusalem. This precedes our passage today. And Jesus, speaking of himself in the third person, says, "And they will mock him," that's Jesus, "and spit on him, and flog him, and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." Everybody understand the context? Because what you see the disciples say to Jesus after they've just heard this from Jesus should astound you. Now, if you need a Bible, raise your hand, and our volunteers will place one into your hands. We're in Mark chapter 10 this morning. If you need a Bible, just keep your hands up high. You'll get one. It'll also be on the screen. Mark chapter 10, if you have one of those Bibles, we're on page 550. For the rest of us, Mark is the second book in the New Testament. It's considered one of the four gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And would you all stand with me as we look at just the next verse 35 through 45 of chapter 10. But you can't forget what's just been said by Jesus, okay? Jesus has just said, "I'm going to die." That's pretty clear, right? Jesus told lots of parables. This is not told in a parable. Agreed? Everybody understands? I'm going to die. That's pretty clear. Not figuratively. He's being very specific and very literal. And so here's what happens. James and John, verse 35, the sons of Zebedee came up to Jesus and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." Yeah, I've heard this before. And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left in your glory." Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." And when the 10, that's the other 10 of the 12 disciples, when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever should be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." You may be seated. Isn't that amazing that Jesus has just foretold how he's going to die? And James and John. Now, what's interesting, Matthew, when he writes it in his gospel account, when you see the book of Matthew, Matthew says that James and John, that their mother actually asked Jesus this question for them. All right? Guys, we don't need our moms asking questions for us, okay? Not for dates, not for job interviews. Let's put on our big boy pants. Anyway, James and John, Matthew says, it says that their mom asked Jesus for them. Jesus. And obviously they put her up to it. And so when Mark says that they asked, most likely you can assume that, of course, they were the ones behind the asking, okay? And so they asked Jesus after he's just talked about his death, they basically say to him, "Hey, when it comes time for your glory moment, when it comes time for celebration, when it comes time for the trophy presentation, we know you're on the main stage. You're the Messiah, you're the big deal, you're the main event, but if you think about Olympic terms, they're like, could we have the silver and bronze stage next to you? Like when it comes time and you're in your full weight of power and you're on the big throne, and he is going to be on the big throne, they say to Jesus, "Can we flank you on either side?" And Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking. This is not what I'm doing with my power only. With my power, I'm going to lay down my life. You don't even get it. And we know that they don't get it because when they begin to get what's really going on, they leave Jesus. They abandon Jesus. So they're thinking this is a power play only. And when it's a power play, we want to be with you. And then it says the other 10 became indignant. Now, the other 10 disciples did not get upset at James and John because they thought they were selfish. The other 10 disciples got upset at James and John because they thought of it before they did. Does that make sense? It's kind of like when you're a teenager and you'd go out with your friends and someone would call shotgun before you even thought of it. You'd be like, ooh, but I'm tall. I need to be in the front. I mean, whatever it is, right? It's kind of that deal. Like they're like, no, we want this position, Jesus. And so the other 10 are upset, not because their hearts are pure, most likely. Most likely because they wish they could be in that camp, or really in the beginning with Jesus right there at the front, kind of leading the way whenever his glory is going to be pronounced in the greatest way it's ever been pronounced. And so, and that's certainly part of what's coming. But Jesus, in verse 42, this is where we'll really try to get into the text. In verse 42, after understanding their assumptions, and remember, these guys have been with Jesus for about 3 years, but they lived in a world that had very different assumptions about power and authority than what Jesus had. Is that correct? Does that make sense? In fact, and I haven't thought about this exhaustively, but I think this is probably true. You know, when it comes to following Jesus, obviously the way things work in his kingdom are very different than the way it works in the system of the world, okay? And we talked about money last week. I think that's a big way it's different. But I think maybe this issue of power and authority and servanthood, this may be the most, where what Jesus thinks is best in his kingdom versus what happens in the world. This may be the issue where the two are furthest apart. Does that make sense? And if you think about it, when you think about pride or arrogance and power and prestige and position, all those kinds of things, in the world in which we live, much like the disciples, power works very different in our city and in our world than how it works in the kingdom of God. Wouldn't you agree? Right? We want to be powerful, not so we can serve like Jesus. We want to be powerful because it means something about us. We want to be powerful because we want other people to be inferior to us. Right? I mean, we want the status, we want the privilege that comes with the power. And what's really encouraging, before you think I'm saying something I'm not, Jesus never speaks down against those who have power and position. But he does speak down those who wield or utilize or leverage their power and position in ways that are not synonymous with how power should be used in his kingdom. And so when you and I think about the prestige, and before you think, Ben, I don't have power, I'm on the low end of the totem pole. Well, maybe don't think of yourself in terms of your company from a power standpoint, but think of yourself as an American and as a person who is able, at least for now, to live in San Francisco from a prestige standpoint or from a position standpoint. And you know, think in terms of that. And then think, okay, if I'm trying to ascend to a power place or to a position or to a specific authority, whether it's in a relational realm or it's in a vocational realm or whatever it is, in a city or, you know, whatever the thing is that you're pursuing power in, the question you need to ask yourself is, why do I want power? And sometimes we just need to be honest and expose our own hearts. Right? Even for me, like, Ben, why do you want the church to grow? Why do you want the acclaim? Why do you want to be recognized? I think there can be some pure motives when it comes to that, and I think there can be some impure motives, not just for me, but for all of us when it comes to why do we want power? And Jesus is just saying, hey, guys, you don't understand. What I'm going to do with my power is use it to lay down my life. And look at verse 42. He says, you know, and I think we can relate to this. Jesus says, you know how this works with the Gentiles. If you look at verse 42, he's like, you know how the Gentiles lord their position. When it says lord it over them, they're lording their position. You know how they lord their position over people under them. And you also know how they exercise authority over people who are under them. And Jesus says, listen, it makes sense because you think I'm the Messiah. It makes sense that you would think that I would lord my position over everyone because I have all authority in heaven and on earth. But then in verse 43, Jesus says, that's the way it works out there. That's the way the world understands power. That's the way the world understands authority. And it's like he brings them in close, it seems like, in verse 42. And he says, hey, you know they do that? And then verse 43, he's like, not so with you. Not so with you. You ascending to power is not about your superiority. It's not about your status. It's not ultimately about your prestige. And then he goes further in 43. He said, in fact, if you want to be great. Now, here's something encouraging. Jesus doesn't try to tone down our quest for greatness, okay? Hear that. But he does try to redirect it. Does that make sense? He's not saying, hey, no, go be average. Don't have a desire to be great. He's not saying that, but he's redirecting what we do with our greatness. And he says, if you want to be great, awesome, become a servant. And if you want to be first, verse 44, like if you want to be at the leader of the pack, then you must be the slave, or another phrase is bondservant of all. Like if you really want the power position, if you really want to know what it's like to have power in my kingdom, then here's what you need to do with it. You need to serve with the power you've been given. Because what he's trying to get them to understand is, hey, I'm headed to the cross, not because someone's more powerful than me, but because I'm actually going to use my power to lay down my life. And what Jesus doesn't use oftentimes in the Bible, he doesn't use all the privileges that come with his power. Does that make sense? So like when you see Philippians chapter 2, Paul writes about how Jesus, though he was equal with God, he did not consider it something to be held on to. When he became a human, that he actually laid down his life. When you see Jesus on the cross, it says that he could call down literally thousands upon thousands of angels to rescue him. That was his privilege, but he didn't give in to that privilege. And so part of what Jesus is trying to help us understand, hey, just because you have all the privileges that come with the power, it doesn't mean you have to exercise all of them. And he's saying what you need to do is use the power, use the position, use the prestige to make a difference in my kingdom by serving people. And then he says in verse 45, listen, even the Son of Man, the one with all authority, the Messiah, the one in charge, the one that spoke the world into being, even the Son of Man, I did not come to be served, but to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. Isn't that astounding? We think if we get more power, we have to do less with the people under us, right? As far as abide by what would be good for them, because we just want them to do what's good for us. Jesus, whom is most powerful, he decides to lay down his life. He decides to lay down his life with the power and with the authority that he has. And I think it begs us to ask the question, and you'll see this on the screen, but how are you stewarding your power and position? How are you stewarding your power and position? We believe God clearly led us to start a church in downtown San Francisco, and as we arrived on the scene and even began to understand more and more about the city, we began to assume things like there seems to be kind of two classes of people, kind of the people that have everything, and then a lot of people who seem to have nothing. Would you guys agree with that by and large? I'm not trying to make just a stereotype, but just the more that we spent time with people, and you may say, well, Ben, I'm in the middle class in San Francisco, right, but you're not in the middle class when it comes to the world, and you're not in the middle class when it comes even to our nation, which is real interesting if you think about just the kind of achievement that's in our area and the kind of intelligence and wealth and affluence and all those sorts of things. And so it began to kind of be a challenge to me to think, okay, God, if these two groups of people who seem so far apart are the people that you're giving us a vision to reach, then how can we be a church that's able to meet the needs of both? And one was somewhat obvious. One was the people who are under-resourced and don't have some of the things that other people have. We realized that we could offer material things, we could offer support, we could offer care, funds, different things like that. And that's kind of how it plays out, how we have our partnership with our elementary school and a woman's place, both here in our neighborhood. And so that part made sense to me. The part that didn't make sense is, God, how do we have a vision for all of these people who seem to have everything they could possibly need? That's a challenge for me early on. It's still a challenge for me. But here's what I felt like God gave me. I was walking down King Street over by AT&T Park one day with some of our team, and I felt like God just laid this vision, just placed it into my mind, and here it is, one vision, a way that both people could have their needs met. I think this was obvious to me, but this one for those who are affluent, who are high achievers, intelligent, who seem not to need anything, what if this group realized that, you know what, they need God. They don't just have what they have because of what they achieve. They actually need God in their lives, and then they come also to a realization that God has blessed them and given them prestige and power and authority and even affluence so that they might be a blessing for this group over here. Does that make sense? So because here's what's crazy. In this one neighborhood that our church exists in, and I know we don't all live here, in this neighborhood that we exist in, it's really the tale of the city is in this neighborhood. Right? And so it would blow your minds. As a pastor, it's fun just to get to know what people do who are, like, it would blow your minds to know what people do who are sitting around you right now. Like, it would absolutely blow. And why do you not know that they do it? Because they carry themselves in a certain way by serving and being humble and things like that. But it's amazing what people, even in our own congregation, do for a living, how well the majority of our congregation has been educated. And so the question for me is, like, how do we understand how to steward our power? How do we understand how to steward our position? And how do we kind of take on what Jesus gave us and learn how to leverage our power, our prestige, our position for the sake of people who don't have access to that and maybe don't have those kinds of blessings that some of us have been handed. And for our church, I think a lot of churches that I know about, it seems that 20% of the people in a church do 100% of the serving, and you probably can guess that it's not that way here, and it never will be. If we're going to say we're out to follow Jesus, then we all need to be in the game of serving. And not just in the church, but outside the church and through organizations and in our neighborhood. And how do we serve the people that are under us, even at the office? Those kinds of things. The servant piece is such a big deal that April 28th, we're actually going to shut down all worship services that day, and the 200 to 300 of us or so are just going to go serve together, if you guys are okay with that. You're like, but Ben, we're supposed to be at church. No, we're supposed to be the church. We're supposed to be the church. And so you'll hear more about that in the coming days, but it's going to be a great day just for our church to go, hey, we're going to try to get out and just and put this into action. Lots of ways to serve here, and if you're not serving here, but this is your church, I just want to encourage you to stop by the volunteer table on your way out. It's right there at the back. You can sign up. There's a ton of areas that you can serve in, everything from being in the band to our tech team, Epic Kids. We have incredible high-level people who come in during the week to help out because their schedule allows it. So tons of ways to be involved in that. Here's something very ironic about Jesus. Though more powerful than anyone who has ever lived, Jesus triumphs through service, not by power. Right? Sometimes I think I need a position to triumph. Sometimes I think I need a certain prestige to triumph. Jesus has all of that, but yet he triumphs by serving. He overcomes by serving, not by lording his position, though he had a superior position to everyone. Just so you know how I think of leadership in the epic culture, and this is an ongoing work in my heart and my mind, but I think of three categories and really rate those categories 1 to 10, 10 being the highest or best, however you want to look at it. But here's the three categories. I think of capacity, like just what's a capacity a person has. I think of buy-in in accordance with the vision that God has given us here at Epic. And then I think of how much are they willing to serve. That's a time issue. It's also some serving takes more energy and effort and even more skill. So I try to think of, okay, what's the capacity of a person, 1 to 10? What is their buy-in? And then how much are they willing to serve? And let me just be honest as I can be. I really think in terms of a composite score, which means this. I would rather have a person who has a 4 or 5 capacity, but a 10 when it comes to buy-in and a 10 when it comes into willingness to serve. Does that make sense? Now, I want all 10s, but, since I'm only a 2 or 3 on the capacity, I got to make sure that we get people that are following along. And remember, we don't become the best leaders by being the smartest, the wealthiest, or the most powerful people in the world. In fact, you'll see this on the screen, but the best leaders in this kingdom that Jesus is bringing about, the best leaders in this kingdom give their lives away for the sake of others. The best leaders in this kingdom, Jesus is trying to reorient. He's trying to reshape. He's trying to go, hey, I know how it works in the world. I know how it works with the Gentiles. I know, of course, your assumptions about me and even about you, if you're part of my mix here as the Messiah. I know what you would think our assumptions would be about power, but what I want you to do is use the power God's given you to lay down your life. It's amazing how often Jesus set aside the privileges he had so that he could fulfill the mission God had given him. And I think the key to this church thriving, as I've already seen bits and pieces throughout the first 2 years, the key to you thriving, the key to you and I being great when it comes to God's kingdom, we have to answer the question is how we're going to steward what we've been given in regards to power and position, in regards to money, in regards to access, in regards to our education. How will we steward what God has given us? And as I close, because I promised you would get out for your football game. Okay, I promised me I would get out for the football game. Here's what I want you guys to think about. And here's how I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray that God would give us more power and authority if we'll use it in the way that Jesus set out to be in the kingdom. And that he would keep those of us who won't steward it well, at least from being powerful until we're ready to steward it well. So that's what I want to pray. I want to pray it for our church. I want us to really kind of measure even our success. Like, hey, how are we stewarding what we've been given? Some amazing, amazing people in our church, many amazing people. And the question is not, what have you achieved? The question is, what are you going to do with what you achieve? What are you going to do with your position? What are you going to do with your power? At the end of the day, why do I want to move up? Why do we want to move up? Is it this... we just want to be part of what the world system is, or are we willing to reject that and go, no, I want the position, I want the power, but so that I have the influence, and so that I use it in ways that are synonymous with what Jesus would have me do in his kingdom. So, would you pray with me? God, I do pray, God, I just pray that we would be men and women, and even be a church teaching our children the ways of the kingdom. And God, when it comes to this issue of power and prestige, leadership, however we want to classify it, God, it's very different in your kingdom than it is in the world in which we live in and observe every day through media, through just watching things in our company and industry, just knowing how our hearts lean on their own. God, I pray that we would use what you've given us to be a blessing. God, I pray that we would leverage our position, our authority if we have any. God, I pray that if we would steward it well and know how to wield the power and authority you would give us, God, I pray you would bless us in that way. And God, if we're not ready to utilize those things according to the way you would have us to, God, I pray you would hold us back from those things until our hearts are ready to learn and walk in a path, not perfectly, but walk in a path of service, no matter how great we seem. God, show us what it looks like to be great in your kingdom, and may that be what we pursue and the reason that we pursue it this week and moving forward. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.